Hi, my name is Nora Gelprin. I work at Advocates for Youth. Thanks for joining me as we review adapting lesson plans for transgender and gender expansive students. So let's start with a quick look at language. Lots of words involved here. Sometimes they can be a little bit confusing. So, your gender identity is really how you identify and see yourself related to your gender. That may or may not be the same as the sex you were assigned at birth. Basically, when your body came into this world and a healthcare provider looked generally at your genitals and said you're a boy or a girl for the most part. For people for whom their sex assigned at birth is the same as their understanding of their gender or their gender identity, they would then be considered cisgender. For someone that those two things don't line up, or there's not alignment between their sex assigned at birth and their understanding of their gender, they may have an identity that is called transgender or perhaps gender expansive. Here's one way to look at how this technology interacts. Thanks to Glisten for this great visual. I find it really, really helpful. The piece in here that sometimes can be most confusing is gender expression that you'll see in the bottom right corner. So, what does that really mean? So, gender expression is how, once we understand our gender, how we express that to others through mannerisms, how we talk, our clothing choices, how we wear our hair, all of those kinds of things. People whose gender expression doesn't really fit what their typical gender role is. So, if my gender identity is male, but the way I express myself tends to be perhaps more androgynous or a little bit more feminine, maybe gender nonconforming. We also use the phrase gender expansive. Just wanted to make those connections to those terms for you. We should never make assumptions that just how someone expresses themselves has anything connected to their gender identity. There could be someone who identifies as cisgender, who's maybe male, who was male assigned at birth, who then wears nail polish and has long hair and has both ears pierced. So we wouldn't want to make any assumptions about their gender identity based on how we see their gender being expressed. So then, how do we know how many young people really identify as transgender? Thanks to the Williams Institute, there's this really wonderful data that shows us among 13 to 17-year-olds that about 150,000 young people in the United States identify as transgender. We also know related to schools, thanks to Glisson and some really great research that they did among almost 300 transgender young people in grades 7 through 12, that more than 8 out of 10 felt unsafe at school. The vast majority had been verbally and or physically harassed by their peers, and as a result are much more likely to cut class or even skip school compared to their cisgender peers. We also know, according to this data, that they're hearing remarks much more frequently from other students as well as from school staff related to their gender identity. We know that they're also experiencing bias when it comes to either around sexism, racism, or homophobia from both school staff and students. One other set of data back in 2012 looking at transgender youth with supportive versus unsupportive parents found that those with unsupportive parents face much more challenges around mental health, housing, related to depression, and even suicide ideation and attempts. Lastly, just to focus in on gender expansive youth, if you look right at the middle column there, where young people who identify equally as feminine and masculine, you'll see that they have the highest rates of those students attempting suicide based on their gender expression and their gender identity. So we know that this is of great concern for all of our young people because they're really at disproportionate risk for a lot of negative health outcomes, the most serious of which is suicide. So, what do? We know our states and our school districts have really varying policies, and we know we need to do more and better to support these young people in our schools and in our communities. There are lots of ways that we can, as individual educators, make our lesson plans more inclusive and affirming for these students. We can do things like avoiding assumptions about gender identity just because of someone's body part. So instead of saying a man's penis or assuming that everyone who has a penis has a gender identity that is a man, you can just say a person's penis. Same with uterus. Make sure when you use or talk about anatomy, you don't need to include gender. You can kind of just make it much more neutral. Just name the part and talk about the parts growing and developing as opposed to the person whose part that body might be on. You can also invite your students and your learners to provide an opportunity to talk about their pronouns and perhaps a name they prefer to be called related to their gender identity. Other ideas include avoiding using really gendered language. So instead of saying boys and girls, time to line up, or boys in one group, girls in another, perhaps find a different way to refer to them or a different way to divide up. You can divide it by things like hair color or height or month in which you were born. All those different kinds of things make it much easier. And avoiding gender role stereotypes. Some other ideas to really avoid reinforcing the binary. So instead of saying the opposite sex or two genders, to really talk about all genders or another sex. Seeing the limitations of all or nothing language. So by saying things like, that may be true for some, but not all, frequently, not some, everyone, most people, that can really help to widen your inclusiveness of your language. And mostly just recognize that gender exists on a spectrum. So let's practice with a couple of examples. Here's a really common way that we talk about prenatal care, and we talk about a baby developing inside of a uterus. But what if we just made some really specific little changes there and just said a person who chooses to carry a pregnancy and they and themselves, a pregnant person being healthy is what's involved with prenatal care. Those tiny little changes could really make all the difference to making these scenarios be more inclusive. Here's another one, really having to do with anatomy, because I hear that's where a lot of educators struggle. So instead of saying all girls, how about we say most girls, covering the vagina instead of her vagina, or a person cannot tell if someone has used a tampon. Just really tiny changes that can make all the difference in the world. So, in summary, it's really critical that we ensure that all of our lessons reflect our transgender and gender expansive students who are in all of our schools and communities, whether we know it or not. It's really important to check with our district and state policies to make sure that any adaptations we're making to our lesson plans don't violate any particular state policy or law. And we know that there are really simple strategies that each and every educator can make themselves to be more inclusive and affirming of all of our students in our classrooms. So thanks so much for participating. I hope you found this review helpful.